Welcome to my studio. I'm Debbie Tribble of Dreamweaver Quilting. It's Tuesday, time for another tiny tip. Today we're going to talk about how to achieve an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Not because I'm the quilt police and want to correct you, but so that you will have a more enjoyable sewing experience as you build your quilt with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Your result will be a nice flat top. So join me as I explore the different options to help you achieve this. Here we are at my Singer Featherweight. I'd like to show you an option to set up this machine. I have a guide that I have purchased from the Featherweight shop. It is attached to the base of my machine with a screw. I have a specialty tool that has a 1/4 inch and other seam allowances in it, and I have set it up so that the needle goes down through, and as that happened, then I simply tightened my guide with the screw, and I'm ready to go. What happens if you don't have something like the measuring device? Well, your 1/4 inch ruler that you piece with could also work as a guide. You just want to make sure that you're right up on it and get in the proper place. If you don't want to use something like that, another option is one of these magnetic seam guides. It fastens to the metal in the throat plate, and then you would do the same thing. You would use a ruler to adjust it, get it moved to the correct position, and then sew with it. It has, as you can see, this little fence. It just kind of guides things in. No matter which of these items you might choose, you will always just want to make sure that you set them up the same way every time. Let's move on to the Bernina. Here we are at my Bernina. This machine has got markings already provided on the machine. You'll notice I have a 1/4 inch line here. That's a 1/4 inch from the center of the machine where the needle is. They also have provided a really nice, you'll have to zoom in here, but there's a little marking right there, and that is a 1/4 inch also from the needle hole, which is right here. This is a 1/4 inch line. So I could put another marking on here if I'd like to, and so I'm going to show you what I do on some of my machines. This is simply a room key. An old credit card would do the same thing, cutting it up. I've got double-sided tape on it from the office supply. It's like poster tape. You may have seen this trick before. And I will just line it up, in this case, on the lines provided so that I get an accurate guide to sew against, kind of a fence, if you will. I'd like to point out that this is a 9mm machine. So the guide I showed in the previous segment that screwed into the base of the machine and went against the presser foot would not work because the feed dogs, in this case, would interfere with that. So that would not be a good choice for this machine. However, this works because it's in front of those feed dogs. Another item that helps is a specialty foot called a 1/4 inch foot. This is one type of Bernina 1/4 inch foot. Here is another 1/4 inch foot, also Bernina. The Singer Featherweight has a 1/4 inch foot. Most machines nowadays do have a 1/4 inch foot offered. This will help when you're trying to determine your 1/4 inch. Understand that where you need to find where your visually fabric is on that 1/4 inch line. So we're going to sew next. Okay, we're ready to sew. Remember from several weeks ago, I talked about sewing on a thread bunny or a leader or whatever you want to call it. It is just a piece of fabric folded over so it's the same density as my seam with 2 layers, and I've started sewing on it. Now my fabric is stacked, and I'm going to lift my presser foot. No, I wasn't quite far enough. Let me get one more stitch. I want to sew right off the edge of that. Lift my presser foot and position this piece right there next to the needle and at the 1/4 inch, so that as I begin to sew, and notice I have a stiletto in my hand. That could be something as easy as a seam ripper that you have got in your hand, or a specialized stiletto. Now, as I'm sewing, I'm using the guide as a fence. Here's the next really important part. We start out strong, and we get excited to pick up our next piece, and we go off base. So what I want you to do is you get close to the edge, is make sure that you're still positioned well. If you're not, then with your needle down in the fabric, adjust slightly and continue on. Continue on, remembering to sew straight all the way to the edge of the fabric. Very, very important this is. It's just follow through. So at this point, I would put another piece of fabric underneath the machine and stitch off. All right, now I'm finished sewing my seam. At this point, I'd like to discuss quickly with you thread types. There are different types of threads, and we'll cover those in an upcoming episode. But when you're stitching your seam lines in your piecing or garments, you want to use the finest thread that you can. Thread weight does make a difference in your seam allowance, so as you're testing, make sure you're considering that also. And by the way, every time I start a project, I check my seam allowance to get myself in the right groove and with the thread I'm using for the project. So once I've sewn, I would just turn the fabric over, slightly press down. I don't want to stretch it, and then I would take it to my iron and press it, because at this point this side is pressed, and I don't know how well you can pick it up on the camera. This side is pressed, it's nice and flat. This one's still flopping, so it's not going to give me the same result as it will after it's pressed. This one has been sewn and pressed, and if I take my ruler and I put it on the edge and I come over, you can see it is a perfect 3.5 inches, and that is what you want to achieve. Following these tips, I think you're going to get there, and if nothing else, you just need to remember that every time a little variance happens over the surface of a quilt, it is multiplied, and that's why the 1/4 inch is important. Certainly not for the quilt police. We want to all enjoy the quilting process, because that's what we're about. So there you go. So in closing, what I'd like to say is that if you will consider what type of guide will best suit your application, think about your thread thickness, and then place your fabric under your presser foot as we described, and do the follow through. You will enjoy the process as you build your quilt, and you will achieve great results. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining me for another Tiny Tip Tuesday. I hope to see you next week.